to you, Vishnu.
Thanks, Holly, and welcome everybody. It's very exciting to be here. Holly, do you mind admitting people?
Yeah, sure, I'll admit, yeah.
Yeah. So I've just posted the day 2 schedule into the chat box, and I just spoke to Abby, and she says that she intends this to be less slide heavy and more conversation. So she has very few slides, which I think goes along with the kind of philosophy of post-qualitative methods to be much more interactive. And I'm very, very lucky to invite Abby, Dr. Abigail Hackett, who is a professor of childhood and education at the Institute of Education at Sheffield Hallam University. And Abby is particularly interested in the role of place, materiality, and body in young children's lives and literacies. And Abby's research has been quite transformational to a number of us in really thinking away from the normal cognitive and developmentalist frameworks and methodologies associated with language and literacy. And she's one of the foremost leaders in the UK and internationally on post-qualitative methods. So welcome, Abby, to our summer school, and thank you for agreeing to speak. And over to you. And also feel free to post a lot of questions and comments in the chat box, like yesterday, as this is primarily intended to be a very conversational style session. So you probably wouldn't need all of 2 hours as in the schedule. So you might get an extended break before the next session. Thank you.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much to Vishnu and colleagues as well for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the kinds of research I do, some of the philosophical ideas that underpin that work, and then we're also going to talk pragmatics as well, because I think that often doesn't happen enough, particularly when we're talking about how we work with communities, how we work ethnographically, and in particular, how we bring those 2 things together with what's being called the post-qualitative turn or the post-human turn. So we're going to explore a little bit what those words mean, what might be some of the ideas that you might be thinking about beginning to explore if you decide you're interested in those sorts of approaches, but also what does that look like when you're doing your methodology? How might that change, or how has it changed for me? So I hope that will be helpful and interesting to people. So as I said, what I'm going to talk about today orientates around 3 things, really. Orientates around doing qualitative research in communities, so with long-term embedded community work. It orientates around ethnography, and it orientates around this idea of the post-qualitative turn as well. I know that quite a lot of people on this call were here yesterday and you've already done some thinking around ethnography. It'd be really helpful if people could drop in the chat a little bit more about your experience or interest levels in those 3 things. So remember, that's embedded work in communities, ethnography, and the post-qualitative. So what do people already know? How might it connect with the research that you're doing or you're thinking of doing in communities? And is there anything in particular that people were hoping to get out of this session this morning? Or perhaps there wasn't, and you just came kind of curious for perhaps some new words like post-qualitative that not everybody's encountered before, and that's fine too. But I'll just give people a couple of minutes now. If you drop into the chat anything you're kind of thinking or wondering or working with already in terms of those things. Thanks, Joanna. So, okay, yeah, fab, just curious. I think it was a comment from yesterday, but Dekra was writing about working with families and the use of English and Arabic. And actually, that's very interesting to me and connects with some of the work I've been doing recently. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit as well. Yeah, fab. Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, so it's interesting, that idea of community as well. Can we think about a community in a school classroom or community of teaching colleagues, as well as thinking about perhaps geographical communities? One of the things that I've unpicked a little bit in my writing as well is, are we just thinking about people when we talk about community? So I've been working in the same northern town in England for the last 2 decades. And I've written a little bit about thinking about community as being around place as well. So it's not just the people. Sometimes the people move on over that time, or they grow up, or they get restructured if they're in job roles, or, you know, families move on. But also, can we think about community as like rooted in a place, and some of the things that have happened over time in a place? Yeah, fab. So it sounds like lots of people are doing kind of qualitative research with communities or in schools, but less around the post-qual. So that's great, really helpful to know. Brill. So I've got some slides, but they're mostly visual. Oh, let me read these. Yeah, Syscom and Adriash is talking to the idea of place as well, which is definitely an interest of mine as well. Like, how is language shaped by, or have a different kind of meaning, or how are relations perhaps recast in terms of place and context as well? So that's definitely something that I'm interested in too. Yeah, and the impact on the community. Yeah, fab. I'm working with home language linguistics with people with disabilities. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Hopefully there'll be lots of things that connect then. And it might be really interesting to think about some of these kind of propositions from the post-qual as well, and how they feed into some of these different kinds of contexts it sounds like everybody's working in. So I'm going to throw up some slides, but they're mostly just nice visuals and notes that you don't have to just look at my face all the time. So let me put these up. Hope everybody can see them all right. It means I can't see that. I can see Vishnu, so that's really helpful. So if I go mute or stop working or something, you'll have to shout at me or wave at me or something. I'll also come out of the slides a bit, because I'd like to carry on asking people questions and having a bit of a conversation in the chat. And I can't do that while the slides are up, but that'll be all right. We'll do little bits of me talking and then little bits of everyone else
Abby,
get
if I
say
can,
as well.
if it helps to,
Yeah.
if you ask questions and people put things in the chat, I can read it out to you. That helps.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. Fab. So as Vishnu said, my name's Abby Hackett, and I'm based at Sheffield Hallam Uni in the UK. And I've been doing ethnographic work with communities in general, but also, as I say, in particular with one small town not far from Sheffield for the last 15 or 20 years. Before that, I was working in museums. I was an education officer, but I was also a community outreach officer in those same communities. So I think that previous work before I became a researcher probably is also important and underpins some of the ways that I've been working. So I do ethnographic work in communities. Sounds like a lot of people will already be a bit familiar with what I mean by that. So that kind of long-term hanging out, being there, field notes, often visual data. So we're going to talk about those things and what they look like, including what do they look like in the post-qualitative turn during this session. But mostly I'm focusing on families with very young children. A lot of my work is with the under threes. I'm interested in children's experience of movement around spaces and their literacy and language practices and how they unfold and are taken up and make sense in different kinds of everyday community settings. So one of the things I'm interested in, in terms of early childhood, there's the bulk of that research is done in early childhood classrooms for really understandable reasons. But one of the things I'm arguing in my research is that's only a part of what makes up a young child's life. It's only a part of what makes up their literacy life, their language practices, the way in which their everyday shapes meaning and experience. So it's really important that we can also have research that is looking at these other contexts outside of the early years classroom. And that's what my work's hopefully contributing to. So as I said when we were chatting, I'm really interested in this idea of place and how place can shape the relationships that might be possible between adults and children, how atmosphere, so things that might be quite intangible about place, might shape how you feel. So hopefully that resonates with people as well, because it's not just kids, right? We can walk into a new place or a familiar place or a long ago from our past place, and there's like a feel and an atmosphere. Places have genealogies, places have embedded power relations. All of these things shape what can happen with communication, I would argue, and language and literacy. So that means there's no one kind of extractable set of language skills. It always depends on the context and the moment and the relationships and the place. And that's one of the things I've been trying to look at a lot during my research over the years. So I'll give you a little flavour of some of the projects that I've done over time. I thought that might be quite interesting as well. One of the things I did really early on in my career is I had a 3-year postdoc fellowship, and I was looking at young children's literacy and language practices in communities, and specifically the role of the non-human. So looking at the role of place, materiality, and the body in young children's literacy and language. And that was very much positioned as, certainly in the UK, there's a really dominant message that small children, pre-verbal children, only or mostly acquire their language from adults. So there's a lot of messaging in the UK that we need to speak directly to babies. We have to talk at our pre-verbal babies constantly, the more the better. Small children will only start to use words if we do these practices, and they'll only use words if they kind of see this sort of functional need for language. And there's numerous quite compelling reasons, I would argue, to kind of question that narrative. Firstly, anthropologically, it doesn't make sense at all. There's lots and lots and lots of communities outside of Western culture where adults don't generally talk to pre-verbal babies, yet they still acquire language, so it's not borne out globally. But also, when we are spending time on the ground with small children and their grown-ups, and a lot of this work that I did was in playgroups, for example, you can see that the things that are kind of the focuses of very small children's energy and creativity and movement and enthusiasm, and often therefore vocalizing on words as well, often aren't the adults. Often, certainly in the playgroups I've spent time in, the adults are sat around the corner of the room, they're having a little break, they've got a cup of tea, they're gathering kind of solidarity and support and friendship from each other. And what's driving the action with the children is the movement, the place, the possibilities of everything from the toys that have been laid out, to the crayons, to the really fascinating fire extinguisher on the wall, to kind of the weather and trees and leaves if they're playing outside. So that was a study that was really foundational, I would say, to my way of thinking about what we're talking about when we're talking about young children's language and literacy practices. And it was really also the beginning of me wanting to take this idea of the post-human or the more than human really, really seriously. So we're going to explore what I mean by that a little bit later on. And some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today draw on this book. So this was the monograph that came out of that study. It's called More Than Human Literacies in Early Childhood. And it lays out those ideas that I've just very briefly outlined about what's going on with the more than human. So things outside the human, and particularly the adult human, and language and communication. But it's also got a lot around methodology in it, if people are interested. So more recently, I've spent the last 3 years working on a project that's looking at children in treescapes. So I did lots of work in an outdoors context, and the project wanted to understand children and young people's views of trees, their thoughts about treescapes, what they value, benefits, challenges, anything from that can kind of feed into policy making as well. So something that is happening a lot in England is people are trying to plant trees. We're trying to increase particularly urban tree cover because it's really beneficial in relation to climate change, shade and temperature, carbon sequestration. So there's lots of policy work around that. This project was designed to feed into that. And this is actually maybe an interesting example of where the kind of ethnographic and post-qualitative might come in. So for some other strands of the project, not the ones I worked on, researchers were directly asking children what they think about trees, what they like best about trees, giving them kind of creative participatory tasks as well. So asking them to kind of do drawings and make maps. What do they think of like trees around their local area or their school? But because of the methodologies that I generally tend to work with, I wanted to bring into this project, but also because of working with under threes, which is something I love to do because of the challenge, because of the way it upends most well-established qualitative methodologies. We had to have a different kind of starting point that was very much about being there, being together, spending time, and learning not from what the children say necessarily, because if you've ever tried to ask a 2-year-old a direct question, you'll know that you rarely get a direct answer. So like that kind of interview doesn't work very well. But instead, learning from what children do. We had this kind of overarching question: what can happen between children and trees in my strand of the project? And the way that we answered that was by being together with children and with trees, all of us together, having experiences in different kinds of urban treescapes, so urban spaces that have trees in them. And we were collecting field notes and visual data as well, like the image on this slide that you can see. And then to give you a last example, some of the current research that I'm doing, I'm back in the same town. So we could talk about this perhaps, but this coming back and having a long-term relationship with one community, something that's really important to my work. So I'm back in the same community, and I'm collaborating with a community researcher called Zanib Rasool, and we're looking at home literacy practices, but with a particular interest in multilingualism, translanguaging, and cultural diversity. So again, because we're in this context of early childhood and the early childhood curriculum and the guidance that happens specifically to England, a lot of that kind of framing really, for example, assumes monolingualism as a norm, which of course it's not. It also kind of has this emphasis on wordism. So this idea that children need as many words as possible in the dominant language, which in my context is English, as quickly as possible in order to kind of ensure school readiness. So we're trying to do ethnographic work that really talks back to some of those assumptions, talks back to what's being overlooked or marginalized or erased, and all the really rich, fascinating practices that are going on in what's actually a very culturally diverse town, with lots and lots of practices that are happening in homes or are happening in kind of community spaces. And we're doing, again, field notes, and we're doing participation with groups and home visits and visual data to try and understand and value and describe some of those practices. and also push back, as I say, on these dominant Eurocentric accounts of what it means to parent young children and support their development and their emerging language and literacy skills. So overall, we've kind of got this ethnographic approach, which is about being there, hanging around, joining in, observing. And one of the other important things, I guess, is that kind of the long-termness and the relationship building. So not every time I visit the site will end up with kind of data being produced. It's also about something that's more encompassing in terms of relationally knowing each other and becoming familiar with each other. Margaret Somerville, who was an early mentor of mine and has written some books that really have inspired me. I'd recommend looking, for example, at Water in a Dry Land. She talks about place body memories. So she talks about the way we spend time in places doesn't just result in kind of the extracting of sort of knowledge or facts that is easy to put into words. It also shapes and changes our bodies, our memories, what we're able to think, the logics that we're able to follow. So I've written, for example, when I was doing the 3-year ethnography, which was such a privilege to have all of that funded time to spend in community, about the writing of field notes and trying to stay in community at the end of a field visit and write field notes, because it matters, it changes things. My body isn't impermeable from the rest of the more than human world. So what my body is able to think or write or come up with or remember is going to be different if I grab a coffee nearby after a community visit compared to if I drive back to the university campus and walk back into that kind of corporate neoliberal environment. Different things come to the surface or cohere in different ways, or logics hang together differently. And I think all of that is really, really important. And some of the things that I'm trying to get out and articulate when I am doing this kind of work. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about place, and then I'll stop the slides and we can have a bit of a chat about that. So I've talked already about this one example about field notes. And I've also talked about going back and back to a community and spending more and more time there, not because I need more field notes. There's something about data. I'll talk a bit more about data in a bit as well. Keep an eye on time because I'll run away with time otherwise. I'll talk a bit more about data in a bit, but this idea that we need a data set of a particular size, and that would be the motivation for going back and back into the field, is something that doesn't really reflect the way I work. So it's not really about building up the data set. It's about this kind of connection, this relationship building, but also the way this relationship building sits in and shapes the body. So we've got this quote here from Margaret Somerville, where she talks about a necessary unraveling of the self. That's a really beautiful way of thinking about it. So how can we think about place in particular in the middle of this? While I'm talking, I'd like you to just have a little think in the back of your mind. I'll ask people in a bit to have a think about the sorts of places your research does or could take place, and how might this idea of place shape what you're able to look at or think about or know from your research. So as Vanessa Watts, who's an Indigenous scholar in North America, has really importantly pointed out, Western social science, even when attending to place, continues to consider place and knowledge as capable of being separated from each other. So we can go to a place, we can collect what we need to know, and then we can neatly cut that out and take it somewhere else and reproduce it. And that kind of abstraction is built in really to that qualitative research model and to kind of Western social science models. In Indigenous ontologies of place thought, however, Watts writes, knowing a place could never be separated. Place should shape methodology, and it's also inseparable from what it's possible to think or to know. So Eve Tuck, for example, writes about place stories that can only be told in certain locations. They only make sense there. The question of how to think with place, how to understand, for example, the materialized and spatialized nature of social inequality or the relationships between humans and place, These are always political questions as well. So, for example, Fikili Nuxmala and Cadillo write that it's really important to continually interrupt the benignity of place stories. We can't have a kind of account of place that leaves out the politics of these kinds of power relations and also the histories that underpin them. One of the ways in which we can commit to the specificity of a place and the genealogy of ways of knowing and how they're political can lie in the question of what forms of knowledge become powerful. If only that kind of rational, abstractable, easy to put into words kind of knowledge is respected or valued or seen as sort of powerful, or even seen as counting as research, right, which is often the case in some academic paradigms, then we can't really take place seriously in the way that Vanessa Watts is inviting us to. Margaret Somerville makes a distinction between two processes of coming to know through research. There's the rational process of logic and order, and then this kind of body place knowing, which is a way of coming to know through the body, unraveling self, but also unraveling certainty or what it is that you thought you know. And this kind of knowing relies on the mutual entanglement between body and place. So you can see here, even just in this quote, in this proposition about knowledge sitting between the body and place, rather than being something abstractable that sits mainly in words, beginning to have a dialogue here between well-established approaches of qualitative research and ethnography and what might happen when we put them into this kind of post-qualitative framework. So remember, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, so don't worry if this is feeling a little bit disorientating at this point. We're going to unpick it. So when we reject the possibility of ever fully extracting knowledge from place, it's a really powerful form of refusal. Rather than giving us new, innovative, cutting-edge research findings about young children's language, instead it points to the impossibility of this. Instead of theory that we can generalize and claim as a sort of masterful, universalizing account of how a thing works, we're left with slow, particular describing, coupled with an awareness of the politics of how this kind of describing then rubs up against these more powerful claims to knowledge. This is something I feel really particularly sharply, I guess, when I come to start writing about literacy and language, because we have these really powerful generalizable claims about, for example, what language acquisition looks like, or what young children need or should be doing in terms of acquiring language. And we've also got a lot of funding and policy behind that in England. We've got a lot of people making a lot of money as well. You know, there's kind of a sort of capitalization of these kinds of big truths with a big T. And then we've got this slow, careful describing that I'm interested in. Like when I'm in this place, when I'm at this play group, when I sit on the floor, when a little child comes and dribbles their dribbly nose all over me, and I realise that I've sat on a blueberry that was from snack time, and we make eye contact, or we have a moment, or something happens that feels really powerful. That's the kind of describing and the kind of moments I'm really interested in writing about. But I've also got this kind of awareness, right, of how this rubs up against something which is much more powerful and well established in terms of like the research canon. So therefore, the ideas that you'll find in my work are developed everywhere and nowhere, but they do owe this particular genealogy to this particular town in northern England where I've worked for so long. The experiences, relationships, field notes, and data that I've collected during this time accumulate often in overwhelming quantities as I work over the decades doing ethnographic work, and also since I first arrived in that town as a community heritage assistant over 20 years ago. But still I return again and again, despite having plenty of what we could call data, because what I find is that it's possible to think differently when I'm there. That's the thing that I'm interested in pursuing. So I'm just going to stop the slides for a little bit. We'll talk next about ethnography and how it might shift when we start talking about this thing called the post-qualitative and what that thing is. But first of all, it would be really nice to just think a little bit more about place. So at the beginning of that little bit of blurb I did, I asked people to think about place, what it means in your work. How does it show up? Do you work across different places? Do you feel constrained or limited about the places that you can work in? We can think about place as more than just location as well. So we can think certainly about going to different locations. I said at the start, I think it's really important we have research about young children that isn't just always located in a classroom. But we can also think about place as something that's a little bit more fluid than that as well. So place can shift even when we're in the same location. Different things can come to the fore. So about this idea of atmosphere as well, didn't we? Like atmospheres can shift, and they can shift over time as well as places move from unfamiliar to familiar, or people get positioned differently within that kind of place. So I wonder if people could drop some reflections in the chat about place in their own research. Anything that connects, but also anything that you feel like pans out differently in your context or in your work. Yeah, that's really interesting about the idea of movement around place and how people kind of shape space as well. Yeah, super interesting. One of the kind of key educational writers for this is somebody called Hillevi Lenz-Taguchi, who's a professor in Sweden. And her book is called Bridging the Theory-Practice Divide, her kind of famous first book. And the intro to that, she talks about being called into this sort of like grand academic office to have this meeting, and being aware of the bodily sensations for herself as she walks into that kind of space and sits in this sort of big grand chair around this sort of boardroom, and just tuning into her own body. So instead of trying to like deny that and feel like you should be this kind of abstractable, objective sort of like professional in that kind of a space, what does it mean to actually tune in to how that's playing through our bodies? And of course, as Sarah Ahmed, right, that's going to be really different for different people. She writes about depending on the angle of our arrival. So things like gender, race, background, class, familiarity, assumptions that people might be making about you in that kind of space. And also like the materiality of all of that. It's all going to be playing in as well. And my argument is that's absolutely the case for children as well. So when children are entering different kinds of spaces, that's going to be something that's really powerfully shaping their communication practices. Yeah, so any more thoughts on place? Oh, that's very interesting, Lucy. Yeah, so absolutely, yeah. That's something that I write about quite a lot. There's some, as you probably would know if it was your PhD, but for other people, there's actually some really like quite concrete empirical evidence about the differences between children's talk in home compared to classrooms. That is really surprisingly kind of overlooked in current policy making in England. But everything from, studies by people like Tizard and Hughes in the 80s, all the way through to Rosie Flewitt's work. She looked at multimodal communication, so combination of both children's talk, but also the other modes they used to communicate with in the preschool classroom and in the home setting as well. And again, yeah, time and time again, we're seeing, there are really important differences here. I always find it really surprising that doesn't play in at all to, for example, when we assess children's language competencies, those kinds of assessments often seem to sit in a sort of, like that task would be a neutral vacuum, no matter where it takes place. Oh, that's super interesting about places being related to home language. Wow, yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting comment as well about this isn't testable, because I guess that comes back, doesn't it, to what I was saying about the politics of knowing. So um, I've definitely had conversations with positivist researchers that have gone, "Oh, is your research just anecdotal then?" So there's this real kind of potential for this work to be dismissed. But there's also a real epistemic violence in that. So I'm guessing this might be something that you explore this afternoon as well. This kind of drawing a line between what counts as kind of evidence or testable, absolutely has a colonial kind of history to it. I think it's also really important for us to think about and potentially be, well, I'm quite critical of, but people could decide. Um, yeah, sight, that's interesting. Mm, yeah, yeah. And that kind of shaping, I guess, by individual, but also potentially changing over time, or also with what Deleuze and Guattari would call haesty. So this kind of serendipity of the thing, the way the thing gets thrown together in the moment. So if you think about maybe examples in your own life as well, where there's a day where everything's just not gelling, or a day where everything's kind of falling into order. There's always this kind of wild element, this sort of unpredictability as well, which if you're following that kind of philosophy, that's one of the things that's going to make it really difficult for research to sort of pull out these generalizable conclusions. So that's, again, going back to this kind of politics of knowledge and what we see researchers doing and what its role is. Oh, fascinating comment as well about Bengali English mixing of the words. Yeah, yeah. And that's a nice example, isn't it, of what I said. I kind of probably didn't say it very clearly, but I was trying to talk about places not being the same as location. So you could argue that when people are doing that, they're evoking stuff, they're evoking different places. Um, and conversely, we've got lots of examples of, again, anecdotal examples of, young children getting quite clear, not necessarily explicitly articulated, but still quite clear messages about whether or not they can use their home languages in school settings. So you could almost look at that as the flip of that example, like what places are allowed and not allowed to be evoked or brought into another place, what aspects of your identity are welcome in a space. It's definitely something that comes up time and again in this kind of ethnographic work. Children feeling like they shouldn't do that as an unspoken rule. Oh, absolutely lovely examples here. Thank you for sharing, everybody. Okay, I'm going to put the slides back up so we can talk a little bit. I'll kind of do a little recap of what I mean when I talk about ethnography, because also it might be different from what Tony talked about yesterday. So that might be really interesting. There'll be different takes. But also what's happened to me as an ethnographer as I've started to engage in some of these philosophical ideas around the post-qualitative. So let's unpack that a little bit next. Okay, so this is a really nice quote from Daniel Miller, which kind of tries to define ethnography a little bit. It's probably quite likely that you've gathered from yesterday. This idea of what is ethnography, what counts and what doesn't count is hotly contested. There's ethnographic purists, and there's also people that are trying to develop new forms of ethnography, particularly to try and push away or act as a counter to some of the really problematic historical roots of ethnography, which was in kind of Western exploration and this almost fetishistic desire to know the other. So there's definitely a whole lot to be unpacked in terms of ethnography itself. I think for me, as an early career researcher, originally, I was really drawn to ethnography because it seemed to fit so well with the kind of community outreach work that I'd already been doing. So this kind of getting to know people and going with quite an open mind, trying to not draw quick conclusions or bring my own judgments, and spending lots of time with cups of tea, just hanging out, and seeing that something that was really valuable to the work. That was all really, really familiar to me anyway, from being a community outreach worker. So that's probably why I ended up as an ethnographer. But here are Miller's suggestions for the commitments that he says underpin an ethnographic research practice. So firstly, to be in the presence of the people one is studying, not just the texts or objects they produce. To evaluate people in terms of what they actually do. I think this chimes really well with what I said about doing ethnography with young children as well. So in particular, my doctorate was looking at children in museum spaces. And if you want to know what a 2-year-old thinks of a museum space, you don't listen to what they tell you so much as you listen to what they show you. So they show you through play, movement, their bodies and their energies, how a place is meaningful. So evaluating people in terms of what they do. This idea of the long-term commitment. In the kind of classic ethnography, that's about this idea that people will hopefully return to their everyday life and you'll get this sort of more objective view of kind of normal life, natural observations. As we've talked about in the little bit I did earlier, for me, I would say certainly the long-term commitment part is still there. But I think this idea of the place, body, memory, and the way that the being there can shape what you're able to think about is much more how I would put it. And then this kind of holistic analysis where we're looking at what's going on, but we're trying to sit that within a larger framework that's about how people live. Miller talks about cosmologies, which is interesting, right? But those kinds of rationales and beliefs and cultural practices and histories and genealogies and inheritances that make a certain mode of being in the world make sense to somebody. So from its origins in anthropology and also sociology, ethnography has come to have this big influence on qualitative research. It's been taken up and adapted by numerous disciplines. And then we have this idea of the post-qualitative methodology, which offers a really serious challenge to this question of knowledge production that ethnography is describing, and particularly the idea that we could extract data, collect it, and analyze it. So this idea of extraction, collecting, and analysing is strong within a traditional view of ethnography, but it's also entwined in its history and development, as I alluded to just earlier. So this history of colonialism, but also in subjugation and domination. So early anthropologists went out with early colonizers and their work was complementary because there was this sense that if we understand and can kind of catalogue people in other places, we can also link that with control and exploitation. So there's a really strong critique of ethnography's origins and also multiple unresolved debates around, for example, voice, reflexivity, and othering. And I think all of these things make this question a really important and interesting one to ask. What is to become of ethnography in the post-qualitative turn? So what do we mean by the post-qualitative turn? When I was planning this paper, I thought I need to begin to provide a kind of broad framework so that we can have this conversation about how my ethnographic practice might have changed as a result of working through this particular paradigm. But it's also, it's like an entire field in its own right. So it's really difficult to sort of summarize or make sweeping judgments. I'm going to do a summary in a minute. But the other thing I want to caution is if these ideas are interesting to you, or you think that they might connect with your work, it's really important to go and do some further reading. If people want some recommendations, then really happy to provide them. But really, the turn to the post-qualitative is supposed to, I think when it's enacted to its full potential, it enacts quite a radical break with qualitative methodologies, rather than being a sort of veneer that you can add over the top. So this might be, if this stuff connects with you, and this is new, which sounds like it is quite a few people on the call, this might be the beginning of a very generative and enjoyable rabbit hole. If it was, that would be lovely. I'd be really happy to hear that started here. So in thinking about what's a good way of sort of summarising some of the key tenets of the post-qualitative term, I thought there's a really good short paper by Paulina Rautio, which is called Balancing Acts. And she talks about some of the balancing acts that researchers have to perform when they're doing empirical research, but they're thinking with post-qualitative methodologies. These are some of the shifts that might happen. So there's 4. The first shift she talks about is the shift around data. So when we do a kind of positivist qualitative methodology, we set out to collect specific data that will absolutely and without doubt align to our research question. So that is a process that is planned and very systematic. When we're working with the post-qualitative turn, our ways of working are emergent. We go with a very open brief and we look to work with what the world has to offer. It might be that we're not clear what our data is until we get to the end of our inquiry, because we won't be clear what it is about what we did and encountered and experienced and read and thought that caused those kinds of shifts and brought about the insights that our work was looking for. So that's the first of the 4 shifts. There's this kind of movement from the planned, the systematic, the guaranteed answer to the question, to this kind of emergence. And I would argue that fits really well with ethnography. So, for example, Shirley Bryce Heath is a very famous ethnographer in literacy research, writes about this idea of going into the field to ask what is happening here. And I think that aligns really well with this idea of data and what it is that we might find out as being very open and emergent. Secondly, around methods. There's a lot of debate in the field of post-qual about whether we need kind of specified methods. And if so, what are those methods doing? There are some post-qual thought leaders who argue that we don't need to be doing empirical work. We don't need to collect data necessarily to do post-qualitative scholarship. So it can be more of a practice of kind of philosophical reading and theorizing. That's absolutely not how I work, as you probably gathered. That practice of being in the field is really, really important to me. And with that practice comes methods to a certain extent. But I would say the shift from the kind of classic qualitative to the post-qualitative would be a shift from learning fixed, correct procedures for doing your chosen methodology, and then reading up on them and then trying to sort of enact them in a very kind of correct way. Shifting from that to taking up methods as a kind of way of opening something up, being together with people in the field and operating dynamic thinking patterns. So some of the key methods that I use are participant observation, field notes. I've also used a lot of visual and video and photography data. So we'll talk a little bit later on in the call what that looks like. How do we move from following a fixed procedure through to something that's very dynamic and fluid and open, but still has its kind of jumping off point from some of these more traditional methods. And you could say the same thing about interviewing as well. So lots of people who are working with post-qualitative ideas are working with interview transcripts. And again, we could talk about what those shifts are. So the third shift that Paulina writes about is around clarity. And I've talked about this a little bit before. Instead of zeroing in on the aspects of what we observe or the bits of the interview transcript that are very easy to understand and offer clear answers to the questions that we as the researcher might have decided we want to ask. The shift here is from clarity to complexity and entanglement. So we might decide that we want to zero in on or stay with or play with aspects of what we've collected or observed or experienced that are really difficult to understand or hard to articulate in words. Like there seemed to be a lot of energy directed in a certain direction or an interesting shift in atmosphere of what has happened. Maggie McClure has described this kind of practice using the phrase the data that glows. I've written with a colleague, Christina McRae, about the idea of sticky data, things that just stay with you that you can't put aside, you want to make more space for. And maybe it's because there's a really generative itch to scratch. It's really difficult to understand what's going on here. And you hope that process of trying to partially understand and move through that complexity and entanglement will create shifts, will create something new. So this idea of the radical shift, I think, is often really important in this kind of work. And then fourthly, and interestingly for us on this call as literacy and language scholars, Paulina writes about the idea of voice. So classically in qualitative research, we think about the idea of the bounded individual and we're interested in what they say and what they mean. So we assume there's this idea of a true individual self who's got a truth. And if we do like the interview in the correct way and ask the right questions, they'll tell us something rational and coherent that explains why they think the way they do or why they do the things they think. So this is all appended within the post-qualitative methodology. First of all, the idea of a true self and the idea that we could express that and it would be sort of mobile. So if I tell you today what the reason is that I am doing the things I'm doing, that would have a kind of enduring truth to it and it would be the case tomorrow. Those sorts of assumptions are appended in post-qualitative research. But so too is the idea of the bounded individual. I think that's very interesting in terms of language, for example. So that might be something that people want to, as I say, go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Deleuze and Guattari, who are really important philosophers in the post-qualitative turn, write about this idea of language as not being my own. It doesn't belong to me, it doesn't sit within my body, and it doesn't express what my supposedly bounded and rational mind thinks. Rather, it emerges from a collective impersonal murmur. So that might be not something that is easy to grasp straight away, but something very, very interesting to sit with and consider. Think about the presentation I'm delivering now. Think about what would that mean if I'm just producing vocalizations that are emerging from a pre-existing collective impersonal murmur in the world. Brian Masumi similarly picks up on some of these ideas. So he talks about the idea of expression as not coming from inside us. Rather than the words being inside me and I'm sort of pulling them out through my mouth, through my kind of expertise one by one to kind of pass this information on to you. Could we think about speaking as always being part of a bigger event that exceeds and precedes our own consciousness and intent? Language, therefore, isn't the property or the responsibility of an individual speaker. So you could think about this again in terms of me talking now on this presentation, but I also think it's incredibly helpful to think about in terms of young children and the emergence of language. Again, we could talk a little bit more about that if we wanted to in a bit, or there's readings I can recommend. So, for example, I've written a paper a few years ago called Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Language. And one of the examples in that paper is a really common early years practice in England where we get children to sit in a circle. We do circle time activities. So we try to get children to speak kind of on cue and take it in turns to speak. And the example that I write about in the paper is called the Hello Song. The children will sit in a circle and it's round robin, so we move around the room. And the teacher starts by singing, "Hello, everyone. How are you? Hello, everyone. Who's sitting next to you?" So our attention turns to the next person, and that person has to say their name. And then we all sing the song, and it moves around the circle. So the practice is for children to say their name. And in that paper, I write about a little girl who refuses to say her name. And I think it's really, really useful in terms of this view of language as existing as kind of not being the property or responsibility of the individual speaker. So it's almost like her refusal to say her name. It doesn't fit in with this idea that like, oh, when children won't speak in the classroom, it's because they don't have the vocabulary. It doesn't fit with that, right? She knows what her name is. Like, it's not a lack of vocabulary. And I also don't think it's quite right to sort of read it as defiance or shyness either. She's kind of creating this little rupture where she's pushing back on the idea that this expression should happen on cue and it should come from the inside of her and it's her sole responsibility. So instead, we can think about utterances as something that are collectively owned. And this plays in as well to the idea of place and relationships, shaping what it is that young children can or would do with language. So that's to give you really brief sort of touch point on some of the assumptions that we might be thinking about or unpicking or questioning when it comes to the post-qualitative turn. And I write about in the book, More Than Human Literacies in Early Childhood, that I feel like I'm continuing to do work that looks like ethnography, looks a little bit like this quote here. So I'm spending long times in communities, I'm producing field notes and visual materials, but I'm also working with these ideas from the post-qualitative and the post-human turn. So I'm working with what Springer and Truman have called the tensions between these new empirical methodologies and existing phenomenological methods. Springer and Truman say that we don't have to invent new methods. We have plenty of methods, so we can still do interviews, we can still do participant observation, we can still do the kinds of methods we want to do, but we need to approach them differently. We need to approach them propositionally, speculatively, and experimentally. They say it's the logic of procedure and extraction that needs undoing. So I think that's very, very interesting for us here when we're talking about the way in which language or knowing perhaps can't be extracted from place, shapes place, but also this idea of procedure as well. So it's not doing a different method. It's not some special post-qual method that I'm going to teach you today. It's thinking really, really carefully about what's happening when we're doing an observation or when we're having an interview conversation in terms of the self, the other, the idea of the truth, the idea of the data and voice. What is happening and how else could we think about what's unfolding in those moments in different kinds of ways? I'm going to just pause a little bit there. The next part of the presentation, I was going to talk a bit about the practicalities of what that looks like. So when I'm collecting this kind of data and doing this kind of research, but I'm also aware that I've just thrown a lot of quite philosophical ideas at people. So I thought I'd just pause for reflections or if people have questions.
Abby, there
I'm
is a
also
question
gonna-
in the chat if you want to if you
yeah.
want to answer. By
I'm just going to drop that reference in the chat as well. Let me scroll up. Is it Uma's question?
yes.
Let me see. Okay, yeah. So let me know if I'm understanding the question. I think the question's about how do we, we're caught in this bind, right? So how do we think about stuff, artifacts, objects outside of the human perspective? Because of course we're bound within the human perspective. So this is this is definitely a philosophical debate in the field, and it's often a critique as well, right? There's level, particularly at post-humanism. We're still expressing the majority of our ideas in words because post-human scholars are writing journal articles. So we're still having to use human language, and we're still viewing the world through a human lens. I think that's true. I think one of the things that I find really generative, though, with these kinds of ideas is at least encompassing the possibility that there's something beyond that, things that we can't know or we can only begin to partially touch on. So specifically in terms of artifacts, we could look at Jane Bennett's work on vital materialism. So Bennett writes about the idea of the object versus the thing, which I think is quite a nice distinction. So an object is the way in which we're naming something from the human perspective, and also we're viewing it through kind of human functionality lens. So it's what that object can do for us. But when we think about kind of the thing or thing power, we might not be able to name all of thing power, but we are making space for an acknowledgement that that object has got a life pre and post the way we as humans have kind of taken it up and made use of it. So she talks, for example, about like a classic example would be plastic. So there's a point at which plastic is an object with a human assigned purpose, and it kind of exists in relation to like human will and desire and interest, but it's also utterly precedes us. It utterly outlasts us potentially, even as a species, right? So that kind of thinking, even if we can't then account for all of that, I find it really helpful because it unseats the idea of the human as the master of all of this. Like, it makes space to acknowledge the things that we can't know, the things that we can't perceive, and the idea that the world isn't there solely for us and to be kind of labelled and narrated and rationalised by us. So I hope I've understood that question, or chip in if I've not. And Hamda's asking about longitudinal studies as well. Yes, I would say if by longitudinal you mean that kind of the long-term sort of ethnographic work, then yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I've been doing. Some of what I'm going to talk about when it comes, though, to talking about methodology is very relevant to that, because one of the things, certainly a few years ago, I was really grappling with was a lot of the early kind of papers that were coming out with kind of post-human theory, and certainly in the field of education, you know, they take like one little tiny example, and like the whole paper would be about like this one little moment. And it would be like really, really carefully theorized. And also, you know, in a lot of those early papers, and this has been, I think, well critiqued by our field and largely addressed, but some of those early papers, so like if you look at that sort of like 2010, when a lot of the first papers around post-humanism were coming out in the field of education, they were very context-free as well. So it's definitely a critique of early post-human work that I think was quite well warranted, was that some of the ways it was operationalized sort of erased like the politics of it. So this very famous paper it was one of the first papers I read, actually, my sort of way into post-humanism, by Hultman and Lenz Taguchi, and the paper's about a child sat in a sand tray in an early year setting. So it's just that moment, and also there's no, like, it could be any child or any sand tray, like this child doesn't have anything else going on in their wider life or kind of identity, like there's just this child and sand, and the paper sort of theorizes that. So certainly, you know, because I was still doing ethnography and I was kind of accumulating all this data, there's definitely this question of, well, how does the post-qual deal with or address that? Like, if we can just theorize our whole paper around the child in the sand, why don't we just like go once, right? Get a video of a child in the sand and then we're kind of done. So how do we deal with big data sets? I think is a really fascinating question for the field. I could definitely talk about how I approach analysis, but also I think there's a lot more work to be done. The idea of thematic analysis, I think, is still used a lot with large qualitative data sets, post-qualitative data sets that have been collected in this way. But the idea of coding in particular does rub up quite uncomfortably, I think, against a post-qualitative philosophy. So that's quite tricky and interesting. There's some really interesting kind of discussion pieces that have been written on that. Because then if we don't have coding, what do we have instead? People love to cite Maggie McClure's papers on the data that glow. So I've worked with Maggie quite a lot, and she once said to me, "Oh, I kind of regret writing that because it's really oversighted, and people almost cite it as like a get-out clause, like, oh, I didn't do coding, I just like looked for the data that glows." And again, it's not supposed to be a phrase that stands in for like just pick the bits of data you liked. There needs to be something that's a deeper engagement. If we're doing this work, we're doing this long-term work and gathering all this data, like we need to be able to give an account of how we worked through that. I think Margaret Somerville's work actually around the idea of place body memory is really, really useful for that. And her work is longitudinal as well. So her book, Water in a Dry Land, and she's got a more recent one called Riverlands of the Anthropocene. And they're both based around years of kind of body place exploration and the stuff that's coming out of that. So I think that's a good place to look for the longitudinal as well. The post-qual method is subjective rather than objective. In terms of how different researchers share different relationships. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes. I'd say they definitely would fall into that category. But also, as I've sort of tried to begin to outline a little bit, we could unpick it a little bit more, they're also sort of pushing back on this assumption that the objective is desirable or the generalizable is kind of the best end goal. So they're kind of critiquing that as well. And this comes back to like the politics of knowledge as well, doesn't it? So they're kind of pushing back on the idea that these are sort of the best or the most powerful forms of knowledge, or they should be the most powerful. And there's a really lovely quote from Betty St. Pierre, who's one of the sort of foundational writers in this space. And she says, don't forget that we've only been teaching qualitative research methods in universities for 30 years. Don't forget we made this up and we could make it something else. So it's a really beautiful quote for pushing back on this kind of hegemonic, oh, but this is the correct and the best, you know, and for kind of highlighting there's always been ways in which people have investigated and recorded and responded to and made sense of their world. Like that's actually what we're trying to do when we talk about research. So it's a really helpful way of just kind of inviting a restarting perhaps of that conversation. Yeah. I'm going to read this comment. Okay, so Naomi's writing about the idea of rigor. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, absolutely. So a post-qual take would definitely emphasize the idea of fluidity and responsiveness, and also what communities need as well. So to give you a really pragmatic example, the trees project I've just done. So that was a really big scale kind of was a lot of funding. It was a very high profile project. And my strand was supposed to look specifically at under threes. So I was going to do things with families, you know, during the term time when the kids were at school. But what the community said, what the families said again and again was, what we want is it's really hard to fill time in the summer holidays and it's really costly. We really want stuff we can do in the holidays with all of the kids. So that's quite a simplistic example, but we shifted the methodology. So all of the fieldwork that we did and the data we have is responding to what the community needs as a kind of emergent view of ethics, rather than one that's grounded in the sort of the original procedure of, oh no, but our kind of selected participants are only going to be this particular category. And then this, just to sort of briefly say as well about rigor. So I think that's something really, really interesting to think about. In the UK, bit of a side note, in the UK, we have an assessment of research called the REF. And when the REF panel is looking at research outputs, one of the categories it's looking at is rigor. So it's really interesting to think about, what does rigor look like then when we're talking about this kind of work? Because I think that's still really important, you know, like I've sort of said previously, it's not just like, oh, grab the bit of data you felt like, or do whatever you think when you get there. It's like whatever goes. But we need to express rigor in different ways. So rigor might be the very careful following and then accounting for the way in which your methodology shifted and changed based on this idea of fluidity and responding to what the community needs and responding to what was emerging. That might be a form of rigor. Also, rigor might be expressed not so much in the kind of rigidity of the data collection methods, but you might be expressing rigor through the very thorough and careful engagement of philosophical thought and theory, and the way in which you've worked that through your data. So that's often a kind of argument that's made for how that kind of more of a kind of post-qualitative or philosophical paper might sort of express rigor. Just say these are conversations that are happening certainly beyond my university, so nationally, but within our unit of assessment, which is education. So little caveat there, is maybe showing up differently in different places, but certainly as a field, we should be thinking about how we can express rigor in different ways, I would say. Yeah.
Abby, there are some more questions, but we got 15 minutes. So do you want to present the rest of the slides, or are you done with the talk? I wasn't really sure.
Yeah, sure. I'll run through a little bit some of these sort of pragmatic things, because that might be quite helpful for giving people a bit of an idea as well. So put this back up, but it's only I'll give a little bit of an overview, but not to keep plugging the book, but these are all expanded on thoroughly in the book in chapter 2. Also, if you're really interested in reading more and you'd like to read chapter 2, but you don't have access to the book, do email me. I'd much rather people can engage with the work, so we can sort that out for people if they want to have a read of it. So briefly, we have this idea of being there, which is really important for ethnography. And I think we've already covered this quite a bit in the talk. How does being there stay very important in the work that I'm doing? But to go back to that Springay and Truman quote, approaching being there propositionally, speculatively, and experimentally. So it's not about kind of solidifying my position, which is what I think being there did for kind of old school ethnography. So as I say, you know, the old school ethnography, the length of time you spent in the field and the size of your data set would sort of buttress your claim to masterfully know, to potentially know a community better than it can know itself and be better at speaking for it than them. You know, this is the kind of dark and problematic side of ethnography. So instead, I'm really interested in thinking about being there, but through this lens of how it changes and shapes my thinking, my body, my unraveling of the self. And then another thing I hope comes out of that, so when I talk about the way that young children are in community spaces, I'm hoping that it will resonate with rather than surprise the reader. So particularly the reader that might work with or live with or research with young children, I hope it will resonate and they'll think, yeah, I've noticed something similar, but this is being articulated through this kind of academic lens in a way that's hopefully helpful. Because this is knowledge that's present in practice, it's present in communities, but it's not always foregrounded or acknowledged, partly because of the reasons we've been discussing about kind of hierarchies of knowledge and what gets to count as sort of academic research. So I hope that by describing things like the messiness, the contradiction, the complexity of everyday life, it's a way of opening up an invitation for others to join in the conversation, rather than kind of inscribing my own account as sort of the authoritative one. So this time, like how much time we spend in the field, is really central to like claims to knowledge that ethnographers tend to make. But instead, I see this kind of long-term commitment to communities and sites as an ethical position. The relationships I'm developing with staff and families and children are essential and unique, and they rely on trust being built over time. How, though, can I think about time and ethnographic research beyond the linear, beyond the predictable passing of a sequence of bounded progressive moments? So this is something that we probably don't have time to go into now, but this idea of time and what it means and what it does and where the power of it sits, I think is really important. One other thing I'd add to this is how useful Sarah Powell and Margaret Somerville's writing is about a methodology of deep hanging out. So they write about hanging out with young children, sitting in the sandpit and the dirt, waiting with humility and curiosity to respond to whatever the moment asks. And I really loved that as an account that kind of encompasses being there, time and place in a really beautiful way. More recently, Eve Tuck and colleagues have written about the idea of visiting as an Indigenous feminist research practice. And that's distinct from deep hanging out, but it's got a very similar vibe, which is about this kind of openness of being there and relationships and being open to change as well. And then finally, to think about like data and analysis and what we mean when we talk about that. Again, we've only got a little bit of time really, but there's certainly places that you can read more, both my thoughts on this, what I've done in terms of how do we think about data and then how do we analyze it, particularly when we've got big data sets from years and years and years of doing this kind of work. And there's also like wonderful writing from other people as well. So there's whole edited books around post-qualitative turn-in data analysis, which are really fun because people are really experimenting with this work in all sorts of ways that involve a radical thinking about data and its relationship with knowledge. So, for example, Anna Vladimirova and Polina Rautio, working in Finland, have written about the idea of data through the lens of friendship. So what would it mean if you were friends with your data? You would spend time with it, you would listen to it, you would be open to it being a mutual relationship where the data would change you and shape you, and there'd be like an emotional engagement with that work. So I think the idea of emotion as well and how that pulls through data analysis is really, really important, but also time, respect, and slowness. So rather than looking for some efficient form of coding where we kind of get the big data set under the control as quickly as possible by chunking it into a manageable number of themes, what would it mean instead to stay eyeballing our data companionably and making friends with it instead? And I write a little bit more in the book about what that kind of eyeballing or companionship with data might look like pragmatically, or certainly for me. It's quite material, really, and embodied. I tend to print stuff out and cut things up and have them spread out all over the floor. So again, there's this kind of sense of how is the materiality of the stuff over time in the vicinity of my body, in the place of my home, shaping and making possible different ways of thinking. And there needs to be a rigor to that we need to be able to describe, but also within that rigor, we need to make space for and to acknowledge there's always going to be subjectivity. It's always going to be shaped by standpoint, by my angle of arrival, what it is I'm capable from my own positionality of observing and understanding, perceiving. And also this kind of wild element in the mix as well, this kind of serendipity that I think is really important because it absolutely underlines the position of the human researcher as not masterful and all-knowing, but instead kind of partial and flawed, and always just trying to bring some kind of insight or conversation to something that's never going to be kind of finished or have sort of neat answers to it at all. So I'll probably stop there just so we have a little bit of time for some final questions. Put up this quote. As you can see, I'm a bit of a Margaret Somerville fangirl, particularly in this chapter. But this is chance here to pause So in the invitation of Betty St. Pierre to not forget that we invented qualitative research and we could invent it in another way. It shouldn't be some monster that's come to own us. We can create this space for pause when a particular assemblage of forms and meanings might come together. And there might be a kind of temporary stability within this dynamic flux of meaning making. And perhaps it's that little spot of temporary stability. That's when our thesis or our paper or our presentation can kind of come to shape. So there's this precarious kind of holding together of stuff that will hopefully produce something that's really generative and useful for the wider field for researchers, but also, of course, for the communities that we're working with and the families that we're trying to benefit. Okay, so I'll stop there just because I said to Vishnu, oh, we definitely won't need 90 minutes. I can't imagine how we'll fill out much time. We pretty much have.
There is a question in the chat.
What ethical considerations? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I could talk to this a little bit more generally. I've never done a field survey, so I'm not the right person to ask for that probably. But there's some really great writing, particularly coming out of North American Indigenous scholars actually, who are writing about this idea of ethics in particular, and how we obviously have to work within the ethical constraints of our own institution, but I think we also have to have a kind of critical relationship with that. And it comes back to this thing about the procedural versus the emergent. So a kind of classic positivist view of ethics would say that you lay out the thing you're going to do, and then as long as you do the thing that you laid out, what you were going to do, that kind of means you're in this sort of position of kind of purity and untouchability, like you were ethical, like tick. And I would say that ethics is, of course, so much more messy and complicated than that. So in any moment, that kind of ethical encounter is emergent, and you're always implicated in it. So you always have to be answerable to the decisions that you made, and to know that you can't know what those decisions might look like down the line. So you don't get to tick the box and say, like, you followed the procedures, so nobody can ever come back to you on that. But specifically around working with Indigenous communities, I think there's some really, really useful writing. So Eve Tuck's writing around damage-centered narratives and the practice of visiting is really helpful. There's also, unfortunately, I can't remember the names. I'll have to look this up, but I'll share it with you. But there's a lovely piece in Nature that's called something like Ethics Boards Aren't Ready for Indigenous Scholarship. And she's an Indigenous scholar working in, I think it's her own community. And she goes in with all her form, she's done all her forms, she's got her consent forms, and she goes in and she brings them to the elders, and they just say, what are you doing? Like, we don't do this here. You're trying to shift relational dynamics. So something really interesting about what kinds of relational dynamics ethics does and doesn't make possible, and what's appropriate for different kinds of communities. So maybe given a couple of little strands, but
there's 4 minutes, and I see one more question here, but I just want to combine this because I'm dying to ask this question to you too. And I think it was a fascinating talk, if I just have to summarize. And clearly I have so many notes here, but I really love the way you said about the slow, careful research, and your data is developed everywhere and nowhere, so that kind of, so to me, it clearly breaks away from positivism, but it clearly a rejection of the traditional qualitative research. So in the session yesterday, I think most of our speakers were familiarizing with all the frameworks around coding, all of that. So you can kind of do a tick box. Okay, I've done that, and that's rigor, which you've clearly talked about. But this clearly breaks away from all that notion. So it's completely new, probably new for a lot of participants here, that we don't have that kind of a strict tick the box framework, right? And I think that's relating to that question of how do we do our analysis, and which you have actually clearly laid out. So my question is not really how do we do our analysis? Because that's depending on your research, depending on what you want to do. But more as someone who is now interested in post-qualitative inquiry, not kind of like realizing the drawbacks of qualitative inquiry, or what would be your suggestion, not in terms of particularly analysis, but would be in your sort of suggestions for that kind of researchers who are a little curious about this to do this, utilize this in their field of inquiry, their field of research?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think in terms of like what would be good next steps, I kind of did a little bit of caveat early, didn't I? That was, don't just read that one Paulina Ratto article and then kind of start. Like, it's definitely a body of scholarship that's really grounded in the reading. So I would do some more readings. I know people are asking for suggestions, so I'll try to provide them afterwards if we run out of time now. And also talking as well. So you're absolutely right. These ideas are a radical departure. They're quite difficult to grapple with, and they're particularly difficult to grapple with if you're in a context or a department or a research centre where nobody else is really thinking about this, or is potentially quite dismissive, right, of these things, which people are. So trying to sort of be in conversation with other scholars, so whether that's coming to a conference or building some networks or finding a reading group or something like that, I think it's really, really helpful. Because even though post-qualitative research is, certainly in education, is quite well established, it's probably got 15 to 20 years now of kind of this work being applied, this idea of the doing is still very much up for question. So it's harder in a way because people are having to invent that, are invited to, not having to, are invited to invent their own approaches and join in with those conversations about what those approaches could be and what they could look like. And all the time, this happens to me still too. You risk kind of getting sucked back into like the powerful dominant narrative or your kind of habitual practices. So it's really helpful to like be able to talk about those ideas about method or how you might be applying a different theory to a little piece of data. That can be quite a nice starting point if you've got a small piece of data, and begin not in a kind of fixed way, but just in a playful way to begin to look at different theories and how they might give you a different way into thinking about that. So Mazza and Jackson write about the idea of plugging theory into data, like you bring the two together and you see, I guess you see if there's a spark, maybe that's what it means by plugging in, but you kind of see like what could happen there. Yeah, I hope that is a helpful answer.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think opening up of the theory is a useful way to really look into this rather than straight away jumping into data and method and analysis. Yeah. Do you want to still answer the last question?
Yeah, examples of post-qualitative research to look at. Yeah, I could drop some names in the chat. That might be the best thing, of people that are, I think, write quite clearly and are doing stuff that's either around childhood or communities or language or literacy.
I have also pasted your book, actually copied your book here, which I think the Bloomsbury one. So that is that more than human literacies in early childhood. I think that feminist thought in child. Yeah, I think that would be a good starting point too.
Yeah, and like I say, if people are struggling to get a copy, do email me. But other people to look at, I'd say Paulina Rautio's work, Rika Hotti's work. You could look at Jane Osgood. You could look at the Common Worlds Collective. They've got a website and there's lots of scholars kind of all who are part of this Common Worlds Collective. You could look at Christina McRae's work. Hope I don't spell people wrong. Rachel Holmes and Maggie McClure. Candice Kuby in the States. And Jay Field. I'm going to have missed out loads of really good people by doing this, aren't I? This is like a very incomplete list. But they might be some people to just start with having a look at, because they do kind of connect. Oh, you know what else? Keely Nooks-Mallow, her stuff's really good as well. She's part of the Commonwealth Collective though too. So those are a few names, and you could just start having a look maybe at some of their papers. They're all looking at, like I say, childhood and literacies, language, communication. So might be like nice, because you can hopefully see some parallels as well with things people are already looking at.
Okay, I think we need to come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Abby. And I think this was such a unique session, and I'm hopefully, even if people are not going to end up post-qualitative methods, but I think it would be a good starting point for people to really think about that these methods exist, which normally they would not have come across with otherwise. And I also think it has given reassurance to some other participants that there is no, as Naomi said, there's no correct way to analyze data, because that always is important to me, because I'm always worrying that, oh, even if I'm doing qualitative, I'm not really fixing into that framework, right? So thank you so much. Now we will have we'll have a 10 minutes break, because I know the session overran a little bit, but this is perfect. We'll have a 10 minutes break, and then we'll reconvene at 11:15. And thank you so much, Abby, for a fascinating talk, and all the participants were really engaging, and all the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fab.
Yeah.
Thank you for the engagement as well. So fascinating to read what everyone's working on. Like, yeah, can't wait to hear more from everyone, all the studies.
Bye, everybody. I'll just they use the same link. I will not, we'll keep the link muted, but we'll use the same link. Thank you.
Fab. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, Joe. Are you here? I just wanted to ensure that if you're here, we could start sharing the slides.
Hello, hello.
Hi,
How
Joe.
are you?
No, good. It's great to see you after a long time.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here.
I know. I'm really excited for this session. We had a great session with Abby, and then this just flows very well. I just made you as a presenter. So, do you want to try and see if you can share the slides?
Oh, yeah. How's that?
Oh, yeah.
Looks good.
Yeah. And then if I stop sharing there, I do have a couple of other files that I'd like to share from my other screen, if that's okay. I've just got some worked examples that I'd like to show. I did have them. Oh, let me just get them again. Okay, so can you see those? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
the same. This one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Just move that one to the front and then I'll stop sharing there. Okay. Good stuff.
Tons. Looking forward to
How's-
it.
Thank you,
Yeah.
so am I. How's it all been going?
It's going really good. I mean, we had a session with Tony yesterday, and that was mostly on multilingualism, but the traditional qualitative methods, which is really good. And then today morning we had Abby coming and talking, which is very departure from a much more radical version of the qualitative stuff.
Yeah, I
so
only
I
just
think,
caught the tail end. I wish I'd been able to join for the whole talk. It sounded absolutely fascinating. But you're recording this, right?
yeah, it's recorded. Yes, yeah. And then
Hopefully I'll be
we
able
have
to.
you now, and
Brilliant.
then
We've
we
got
have
the
afternoon.
disruptors on day 2, haven't we?
Yeah, it's all disruptors.
The troublemakers.
Yeah.
The troublemakers, yes. And the decolonial methodologies in the afternoon. So yeah, so it's very exciting.
Excellent, thank you. I've tried to engineer things a little bit so it touches very lightly on some of those topics as well. So it kind of feels like it has a cohesive place in the summer school, I hope. Yeah. I have put a note about this in the slides, but I was aiming to talk for about half an hour or so, and then I was hoping we could have some reflection and some discussion in the second half, so that.
Sorry, no, you could ask a lot of questions. They're very engaging. So you could also ask questions as you go. People would put that answers.
Yeah. I've put points of reflection throughout. Maybe I could stop during those, but yeah, I just thought it might be nice to make it a lot more interactive rather than me talking for 50 minutes and then have 10 minutes of questions. I just felt that might be a bit tiring just before lunch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, people have been asking questions in the chat, haven't they? But people haven't really been coming on. It'd be really nice to see faces, and so maybe you'll get people out a bit.
But I like that though, because it's kind of the multimodality too. It's I like because then you can also
no, it's great, but
yeah.
Okay,
yes. So we'll start in a minute. I think some people will start coming in, but because we only got an hour here, and I'll just start with the introduction. And if anyone is coming in the meantime, while I'm introducing you, I think Holly can let them in.
Sure. I probably have to leave just before the end, so don't.
No worries. Thank you.
So sorry,
thank you, Holly, for being here today.
Yeah, no, it's been great. It's been fascinating. I love all this, and I might try and join on the train actually in the third session if I can, because it's a very good education for me. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with it because it's 11:15 already. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. So welcome to the second session with Dr. Joe Billington. And Jo is actually from our own University of Reading, where she's a lecturer here. Jo's research focus on the lived experience of autistic children in mainstream primary schools. Jo's work is rooted in the neurodiversity paradigm and use various qualitative and arts-based methods to involve autistic children with a range of abilities and communication preferences in research about their everyday lives. Jo is particularly interested in autistic thriving and currently the co-founder of the Center for Autism and Wellbeing Hub, a 5-year funded project aimed at developing a range of activities to support autistic children and their families to lead flourishing lives. So we are very excited to have you. Over to you, Jo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishnu. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I would say good morning to everyone, but I appreciate we have many people here for whom it's not morning. So wherever you are, I hope it's a good day.
I'll just
Okay,
mute that person.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about me, I know Vishnu gave you a bit of an example there. I'm a researcher and lecturer in the Centre for Autism here at the University of Reading. I'm just upstairs from Vishnu right now. I have a PhD in psychology, but my first degree was in applied linguistics. So language is still very close to my heart. I'd probably say it was my first love, academically speaking, and it's really central to the research that I conduct. It's really central to the interpretative process that I engage in. As Vishnu said, my research focuses on the subjective everyday experiences of autistic children in mainstream primary schools. And what I'm really interested in is the experience of being an autistic child in an environment that is kind of largely designed and built by and for non-autistic people. And I use a range of different qualitative methods and arts-based methods, like non-speaking methods, to include autistic children in meaningful research about their everyday lives. I'd also like to give you my positionality statement. I think that's really important, isn't it, given that we're here talking about qualitative research and positionality being so central to that. So I suppose the key thing to point out is that I am a non-autistic autism researcher. And as I'll explore later in this talk, that places me in a very particular position in relation to my participants, that it's very important, in fact, essential, that I am mindful of at every single stage of my research. My research is rooted in the neurodiversity paradigm, and what that means is that I don't conceptualize autism as a disorder or a collection of deficits, but rather as a core dimension of a person's identity. That's not to say that I dismiss or minimize some of the very significant challenges that autistic people and their families experience in being in a world that may not understand their authentic ways of being. And so what I'm specifically interested in my research is looking at the relationship between the experiences of disablement that my participants talk to me about and how they connect to the ideas of social justice in relation to the forces of stigma and marginalization in their lives. So just to talk a little bit about framing what I'm going to be talking about today. So what I really wanted this to be was an opportunity for us to be able to reflect collectively and individually on our roles as researchers, as qualitative researchers, rather than it being a kind of how-to guide for conducting IPA, not least because there are much better guides out there than I could possibly give you. Instead, what I want to do is to be able to touch on some of the wider themes of the summer school, so post-qualitative approaches and decolonizing methodologies in particular, but do that through a lens of IPA, using a worked example from my own IPA research. You don't need to know anything about IPA in order to engage with the ideas in this talk, but if you do, then that's fantastic, and I'd love to hear about that. Because I'm an autism researcher and because I work within the School of Psychology, obviously the things I'm going to be talking to you about are going to be autism and psychology centric, the examples that I give. But I hope that the key points that I'm trying to make will have much broader application. I'm going to be using our recently published paper as a basis for this talk. And if you'd like to access that paper either now or later, you can do that through the QR code. So I'm just going to linger on this slide for a bit longer if anyone wants to follow that QR code. But I'd also be really happy to put the link in the chat later. And also, I'd be very happy to share my slides if you would like to see a copy of them. I'm going to talk for about half an hour because what I want to be able to do is make this much more interactive than the kinds of talks that I would normally give, and I'm just talking about methods. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion and your own personal reflections. I'd really love to hear about how the themes in this talk relate to the work that you do or that you're planning to do or that you've done in the past. And even if you're not an autism researcher, please consider how these themes in the talk that I'm about to deliver might relate to your own work, particularly if you work with groups and participants that might be defined as minoritized or marginalized in some way. And of course, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts. Brief content warning. I make a brief reference at the beginning of my talk to some of the historical terms that have been used to describe autistic people throughout the kind of history of autism research, which many people, myself included, find highly offensive. I'd like you to know that I only use these to exemplify the reductive aspects of historical research paradigms, and I only refer to them briefly and don't dwell. Okay, so I want to place what I'm talking about within some context. And the foundation for what I'd like to talk to you about today, and indeed the paper that this talk comes from, is about the concept of epistemic injustice in autism research. So epistemic injustice refers to the harms that are inflicted on our capacities as knowers, as creators and interpreters of information, essentially our expertise in ourselves or in a given subject. And that injustice, according to Miranda Fricker, the philosopher who coined this term, they arise from the imbalances in power between social groups. And one social group, of course, is the imbalance between researcher and participant. And according to Fricker, that injustice can fall into two different types. Testimonial injustice, where minority experiences are discredited or dismissed in some way on the basis of prejudice and stigma, or hermeneutic injustice. And this is where the necessary tools that are needed to interpret those experiences of minoritized people are lacking or missing. And we can see evidence of both of these forms of epistemic injustice throughout the history of autism research. When we think about the language that's been used to describe autistic people throughout the history of autism research, we see it. So in the 1920s, autistic children were described as feeble-minded and retarded. In the 40s, the kind of boom time, if you like, for kind of seminal, so-called seminal studies on autism from Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, they referred to autistic children as being psychologically disturbed. With the advent of brain scanning technology, this inevitably led to the narrative around brain damage. Through to the 90s, with psychological theories leading to the assertion that autistic people lack a part of what it means to be human. And then, of course, in recent decades, with the advent of technological advances in biogenetics, etc., we see a whole new kind of narrative around autism research that is kind of infused and entwined with the language of genetic risk and economic burden. And we see the othering and the dehumanization just in the linguistic terms that are used to describe autistic people through these through this historical lens. And sociologists Milton and Brecker maintain that this othering, this dehumanizing, this undue emphasis on the perceived deficits of autistic people, the pathologization of autistic ways of being by non-autistic people, means that autistic people have been excluded from the knowledge production in autism. And so what we see largely is the prioritizing of stakeholder or proxy accounts as being somehow more valuable than the accounts of autistic people themselves, more valid than the accounts of autistic people. And this graph that I'm showing you here comes from my PhD research. And my first study was a systematic review. It was a qualitative metasynthesis of the existing research at the time. This was about 2018, existing research on the school experiences of autistic children. And this chart here represents about 400 papers. And as you can see, the vast majority of informants in these studies were parents, teachers, and others, the others being predominantly kind of allied professionals, so therapists, social workers, educational policymakers, etc., with just a very small percentage, just 4% of those papers being actually kind of related to what autistic children themselves were saying about their lives at school. So again, we see here, and again, I'd like you to think about, you know, for your own research area, you know, is this a trend you see in your own field too, in that there is a kind of tendency towards kind of seeing particular people as being unreliable in some way in terms of their contribution to research. In fact, when I first started my PhD research, I was speaking to a very senior, very well-known autism researcher. And when I explained that I would be talking to autistic children about their lives, he was surprised. And he said, you know, he reminded me that autistic children are notoriously unreliable, is the phrase that he used. So again, we see that the epistemic injustice in this, that there is this exclusion of certain voices. And this is kind of encapsulated in this quote from the autistic activist, the late Donna Williams, who said right from the start, from the time someone came up with the word autism, the condition has been judged from the outside by its appearances and not from the inside, according to how it is experienced. And this idea that there's this judging of autistic people from the outside by the appearances rather than from the internal experience has kind of been woven into a theory developed by autistic sociologist Damien Milton called the double empathy problem. Now, this name is a kind of play on words on the myth that autistic people lack empathy, the very, very offensive myth about autistic people's lack of empathy. And what Damien's saying here is that essentially seeing autistic people as unreliable in some way, or seeing them as being flawed communicators or flawed in lots of different ways, is actually rooted in this idea that actually autistic and non-autistic people just simply experience the world in very different ways, interact in the world, exist in the world in very different ways. Both are valid, both are valuable. But because of the power differences between those two groups, between autistic and non-autistic people, autistic ways of being are seen as wrong and in need of correction or cure, dare I say it, while non-autistic norms are seen as right and they're seen as the measure of how things should be. And what this results in is that autistic people are seen as deviant, when in fact, actually, what's needed is support and adaptation on both sides in order to bridge what Damien refers to as the empathy gap. Now, I would argue that even though this is absolutely central to kind of autism research and a really powerful idea in autism research, it actually has applications much more broadly, because what Damien's referring to here is just the very idea that people who inhabit different spaces in the world experience the world in different ways. And how do we bridge that? And I think that's a really important thing to contemplate, to reflect on as qualitative researchers, because unless you are an insider researcher, chances are you do inhabit and occupy a different space in the world from the participants that you're working with. As an adult, I occupy a different space to my participants in that they're children, for example. So there's lots of different threads, there's lots of different dimensions to where this empathy gap may form. And so we can expand that beyond the realms of autism research. We can expand this idea of there being an empathy gap more broadly. And we see that so much in psychology. You have to forgive me, my knowledge of the kind of language literature is kind of diminished over time since I finished my undergraduate degree. But what we do know is that diversity exists in abundance in the natural world. Yet in psychology research in particular, there's still a very strong bias towards what anthropologist Joseph Henrich refers to as weird societies. We see these as being, you know, the control group, but in fact, they're incredibly weird, incredibly strange in that there is this strong bias in psychology research towards Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies. I'm happy to say that in recent years, there's been a big drive towards working with more diverse groups of participants. Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge, certainly in the UK at least, that the research community still tends to be quite homogenous. We don't see that level of diversity that exists in nature being reflected in anywhere near kind of equal proportions within the academy. But there is a shift. We are engaged in a paradigm shift, which makes this a really exciting time, personally for me, to be involved in the research discipline that I am. We're seeing more and more challenges to these colonial ideas, challenges to the weird concept that Joseph Henrich cited there. We're also seeing much more of a push towards participatory research, really thinking about challenging that testimonial and hermeneutic forms of epistemic injustice, in the sense that we're placing autistic people within the position of being the experts in themselves. More and more funding bodies, more and more journals are demanding participatory research practice in order to allocate funding or to approve publication. It's a slow shift. It's not moving fast enough for me personally, but it's happening. And that's an important thing to take heart. So what does this have to do with IPA? So where does IPA come into all of this? Well, if you don't know what IPA is, I just thought I'd give you a little summary. So this is from Michael Larkin. These are his words. And Michael is one of the founders of IPA, one of the kind of developers, the original founders of IPA. He says that IPA is a meaning-focused, qualitative method which is committed to understanding the first-person perspective from the third-person position, so as far as possible, through intersubjective inquiry and analysis. It offers an established, systematic, and phenomenologically focused approach to the interpretation of first-person accounts, and is committed to situating personal meaning in context. So it's rooted in this concept of phenomenology. And what is phenomenology? Well, it's the philosophical study of being. And IPA draws particularly on the work of a range of phenomenologists, such as Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, to provide a framework for thinking about lived experience, to be able to examine lived experience. And as Moran and Mooney say here, it's difficult to characterize phenomenology as a single entity. Rather, it's an ongoing conversation, a way of seeing and a movement. And central to this kind of process of interpretation and being rooted in the subjectivity, the intersubjectivity of that interpretative process, is this thing called the hermeneutic cycle. So hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. And essentially within IPA, there is this process, this necessary process that is the heart of the analysis, which is that the participant is trying to make sense of the world, and then the researcher is trying to make sense of the participant making sense of their world. So, and in fact, I think you could actually add a third element to this hermeneutic circle, in the sense that once the research report is out in the world, published and made available to readers, the reader is then joining that circle in making sense of what the participant was making sense of, that the researcher then was making sense of, etc., etc. And so this circle continues. And that process of meaning making within that circle is highly subjective. Each member of the circle, each participant in that process is bringing with them everything of themselves in terms of the way they exist in the world, their core values, their core understandings of the subjects and the participants in question. So all of this meaning making is a co-constructive act between the researcher and the participant, and then ultimately with the reader too. And so what I get asked a lot about, in particular with autism, is how do I adapt that process to work effectively with autistic participants? How do I map that on to the double empathy problem, to bridge that empathy gap? And I get asked this a lot by non-autistic researchers who'd like to do much more meaningful, authentic work with our autistic participants. And my question then is always, well, what actually is in need of adaptation? Because people will often say to me, how do I adapt IPA to work with? And actually I'm saying, well, who and what? We need to step back a bit and think about what is in need of adaptation here? What needs to change? Is it the research process or is it the researcher? And this is where we come back to the importance of positionality and reflexivity, which are absolutely central. They're the cornerstones of high quality, ethical, authentic, qualitative research. And Dahlberg say that we can only have an authentic meaning-making process when we've developed a heightened self-awareness, where our level of self-awareness, our level of self-knowledge about what we bring as researchers has reached the point where we are open for the new, an improvisational openness where we don't know what will show up, but we're attentive and ready for it. And this is what makes qualitative research for me so appealing, so inviting, so invigorating, and so inspiring, is that it's that being open, it's that being ready, it's that not knowing, which of course, I think it was something that your previous speaker talked about in terms of ethics and so forth, and the kind of constraints that we find ourselves in academic research, is often we need to know exactly what we're going to be doing before we do it. And of course, that certainly, as far as this is concerned, certainly this improvisational openness that Dahlberg talk about, kind of stands in opposition to those ideas that are kind of rooted in notions of rigor and quality in research, these kind of positivist and post-positivist ideas around that. But what we find is that although that positionality and reflexivity are frequently cited as being essential to this quality process of good qual work, it's been observed that engagement with these processes can sometimes be superficial or even performative, like a tick box exercise. And what I invite you to do here now and perhaps afterwards is kind of think about in your own work, or perhaps in the work that you've read when you've been reading around your subject, is, how often do you see a really clear positionality statement? How aware are you when you're reading qualitative research of who the people are who have been doing it? What's their relationship? How have they situated themselves in relationship to their participants, in relation to their subject, in relation to the context in which this research project is taking place? And reflexivity, the process by which, as researchers, we revisit these ideas of positionality regularly and transparently throughout the entire research process. How well is that described in the research that you read? Have you got a real sense of how those reflexive processes have been engaged with and embodied and interwoven throughout the research process? How clear is that to you? And then we also need to think about what I consider to be a bit of an elephant in the room, this conspicuous but not spoken about idea is that in qualitative research, we give primacy to speech. And here, Jonathan Smith, again, one of the founders of IPA, talks about, you know, the fact that in-depth interviews are our kind of central form of data collection in qualitative research. He describes it as an exchange in which, for the most part, the participant talks and the interviewer listens. But in relation to my own research, around a third of autistic people are non-speaking. So how does the advert that I might send out recruiting for a particular study that immediately kind of cuts off around a third of people who might be interested in taking part, might have something really important to contribute. Also, speaking autistic people report finding speech challenging or even impossible if they're tired or stressed or sensorially dysregulated. And when we think about our standard research practices where we might invite somebody into an academic institution which is brightly lit and noisy and stark and unfamiliar, we can see how that can lead to sensorial dysregulation or stress. Also, autistic people have expressed a preference for written over spoken communication, especially when interacting with unfamiliar people, which for most of us, we are unfamiliar with our participants, certainly in the beginning. So again, we have to think about how do our standard practices enact a form of injustice before we've even begun the process. This primacy that we give to speech, primacy we give to spoken interviews in qualitative research, to what extent does that maintain, inadvertently perhaps, some of those unjust processes? And this has led some people like MacLeod, for example, to say that there can be a tendency in qualitative research methodologies to exhibit an elite bias, whereby only the most articulate members of a given group are recruited to studies. So a point of reflection here would be, you know, what adaptations might we need to make to ourselves and our research practices to counter epistemic injustice? And I'd like to just pause there and offer some chance for reflection on that. What adaptations might you make in order to counter some of those perhaps inadvertent injustices? I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can see you. And the invitation here is kind of thinking about the role that we as researchers might make in kind of thinking about how we can make adaptations to how we think about our research to make it more equitable. Is there anyone who would like to offer a thought or a reflection on that? So Lucy's talking about having used talking mats. Yeah, absolutely, a non-verbal thinking communication tool. Lucy, how did that work for you? Is it something you'd be happy to come onto the microphone to talk about? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I've been leading a research priority setting partnership with children and adults with DLD, as well as parents and professionals, to identify, you know, sort of top 10 research priorities, which, yeah, kind of co-produced. We had some adults with DLD in our steering group from the beginning, and they were probably relatively able and articulate, as you mentioned before. But then we started to think about how we could include younger children and those with more severe or more significant communication differences, let's say. And basically we decided to use this talking maths approach so that students could visually indicate their priorities. However, there are limitations because we had to sort of give them some options to be working with in terms of pictures that they would then organise as being more or less important to them. We did have some blank pictures if they wanted to kind of indicate their own ideas, but that was more difficult for those students. So I think even when you're trying really hard to offer different ways of contributing, and even us as professionals, I suppose somebody with more communication tools at their own disposal maybe is able to put forward their ideas, or maybe we just need to keep thinking about different ways. I mean, we did involve parents as well, who obviously know their children and have seen them in different contexts and maybe can advocate for them as well. But this was an attempt to do something more inclusive, but I do think it, it has limitations.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I'm also fascinated by Kimberly's contribution here about using sign language interpreters. And what I didn't know that all TV in Barbados has now done a split screen with a sign language interpreter, which is just wonderful to hear. Really interesting. And of course, Vishnu rejecting those notions of disorder and pathologies, and approaching language practices with a sense of curiosity and wonder, I think is just such a great phrase and such a wonderful sentiment. Absolutely. This idea that there is always, that there is something to learn from engaging someone who has a different communicative practice than your own. I'm just going to reshare my slides here though. Because what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you an example of a real example of where I had to really kind of think very hard about my own practices as a researcher. And this was a research project which is yet to be published, but took place in the kind of aftermath of the COVID lockdowns. And it was with 10 autistic participants who were in what we call years 5 and 6 in UK primary school, which is the kind of the last stage of primary school before you go to high school. So the age between about 9 and 11. And I used IPA to conduct a detailed examination of how they experienced being at school and how they made sense of those experiences. And we used a lot of creative methods in here. So lots of participants used photography. So they photographed their school experiences, their everyday school lives. Others chose to write, others chose to draw. There was a lot of different kind of artistic involvement. And before we conducted any of the interviews, because it was interview based, there were a number of different familiarization exercises that we went through. It was all done online. And so they could be in their own homes, wear what they wanted to wear, they could sit how they wanted to sit, they could do whatever they needed in order to be sensorially comfortable. And I just want to show you something about a particular participant. So 8 of the participants engaged with the study in ways that you might think are kind of fairly typical. So we conducted a spoken interview for about an hour or so, and I went away and analysed it. But for these 2 participants, one of which I'm going to focus on today, things were slightly different. So I'm just going to stop sharing that screen, and I'm going to move to my screen over here to share something else with you. So hopefully you will be able to see this. I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. So this is an excerpt from the transcript of a girl I'm going to call Emily. This is a pseudonym. And I say to her at the beginning, so I'm going to start, before we go on to your photographs, I'm going to start with a really big question, a broad question, and that is, what is school like for you? A very long pause of about 40 seconds. And then I'm starting to think, gosh, that was way too big a question. I need to break this down. That was not specific. So I said, is it too big a question? And then another long pause. And I said, okay. And then in my mind, I'm thinking, this is way too this is way too broad. This is not specific enough for her. So I said, okay, let me try a different question then. What are the things about school that you enjoy the most? And she does respond to this, but it's very, very quiet. I can barely hear her voice, and this is happening over Teams as well. And so I say, pardon? And again, unclear, very, very quiet voice, but she is trying to tell me. And I said, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you say that again, please? And at this point, Emily's mum is involved, and she says to her, use your really big girl voice. And finally, Emily says, gymnastics. And Emily's mum says, that's it, good work. And I say, gymnastics, so you really enjoy gymnastics. Is that something that you get to do every week? And again, she's trying to reply, but it's very, very quiet voice. I said, and what do you like most about it? What do you like about gymnastics? And again, there's a very long pause. Emily's mum tries to prompt her and get involved. I'm starting to feel incredibly uncomfortable now. This is clear that Emily is not finding this easy. I'm starting to worry about the ethics of what we're doing. And Emily says, it's fun. But I didn't hear her. I couldn't make out what she said. Something to do with my headphones, or maybe something on the screen. And I said, it's fun? Sorry, is that what you said? I wasn't quite sure. I think the microphone's it's difficult to hear. Emily tries to respond. And then she says, yeah, at the end. And so at this stage, it was really clear that this was not the right medium for Emily. This was not the right process for her, that something needed to change. And so with her agreement and with the agreement of her mum, I decided that we were going to end the interview there. But I said to her at the end, I said, okay, this is not a good time. I don't think this is the right time for you. And maybe this isn't, maybe we need to go away and have a rethink about this. But I really, really still want to hear about what you have to say. So if you want to email me anything, if anything comes to mind afterwards, then please just drop me a line. Your mum has my email address. I'd be really happy to hear from you. And I kind of thought that I wouldn't hear from her again. I kind of thought that Emily just really didn't want to take part in this research, or maybe found it too difficult, or maybe I hadn't made it accessible enough for her. And I went away and I spoke to lots of people about what I should do. And I have to say, this didn't come from my supervision team, but generally the advice outside my supervision team was that Emily needed to be excluded from the study. But I couldn't include her because she wasn't able to contribute. And this was something that I immediately was not willing to do. I really wanted to include Emily, but I wasn't sure how. And I thought about this overnight and I was really perplexed by it. But the next day, when I checked my inbox, I received this from Emily. Emily had written me a 7-page book about her life, which was just extraordinary. And she goes into so much detail about her life. And I won't go through all of it with you now, but I'm just going to go down to where she talks about movement. And she says, just letting the screen catch up, she says, I can't sit still. I always need to be moving. So at school, I'll normally be shaking my feet under my chair. That might be why I like dancing and gymnastics so much, because it requires a lot of movement. It feels hard to sit still for so long at school. So my teacher will normally send me on jobs so that I don't have to. She sends me on jobs like putting rubbish in the bin and handing out things, which is my favourite because I get to walk around the classroom. I fidget a lot at school, and I'm not sure if I like it or not, but I do it. And just in this paragraph, there is so much richness about Emily's life. She talks about needing to move. She talks about how that, that need is almost kind of an ever-present. I got a sense of an ever-presence around it. She connects it to why she loves dancing and gymnastics so much. Whereas in the spoken interview, all that we could establish from her, because of the barriers of the process, was that it was fun. Here she's talking about, she loves it because it requires so much movement, and movement is such an important part of who she is. I also get a sense from this about the relationship that she has with her teacher, and how her teacher really understands that need and gives her very subtle ways that need without drawing attention to Emily, while not making a kind of focus of her. I also get the sense from this that Emily feels a sense of ambivalence around that movement. How she says, I fidget a lot at school and I'm not sure if I like it or not, but I do it. And then also another section that I'll just share with you, which I think is really relevant to what we're talking about here, about that primacy given to speech. She talks about using my words. She says, at school, I don't talk when I'm sad, so I just nod and shake my head. Normally, I'm just sad because I'm tired. It feels like I can't talk when I'm sad because it's too overwhelming. I also nod and shake my head as another way of saying yes and no. So here we can just see just how effortful speaking is for her, how for Emily, non-speaking is a form of retreat, it's a form of restoration. It's what she does when she's overwhelmed. It's a place of protection, perhaps. And these are all themes that I then explored with Emily in a really long and detailed email exchange that we had for weeks after this point. We used this document with the comments features in Word to continue our conversation. And in the end, Emily's contribution to this study was enormous. The richness of her experience and the trust that she gave me in sharing those experiences were incredibly important. Yet, had I stuck to this kind of uniform idea of kind of, rigorous research processes, the uniformity perhaps of those processes, then Emily would have been excluded from this study. And, I find myself being aghast at that idea happening even just in one study, let alone on an industrial scale. I'm just going to stop that and go back to my slides here. Sorry, this is the challenge of using two screens to share my work with you. Yeah, I just want to kind of give a final point of reflection, which I think might kind of link with the previous speaker and those kind of post-qualitative ideas, is how do we free ourselves from these rigid ideas about methodological rigor that can inadvertently maintain unjust research practice? How do we kind of unshackle ourselves from those ideas and not only kind of accommodate the Emilys in our research, but actively celebrate and build that into our research practice, that different participants can engage with this process in different ways. They don't all have to do this in this kind of uniform, homogenous way. But I just want to give a quick thank you to all my participants for their trust and their astonishing expertise. I also want to thank my autistic mentors, Barney Anglis, Anne Lemott, and Philippa Smith, who guided me in my reflective practice, and my kind of commitment to trying to bridge the empathy gap. They supported me through those processes. Also to my team at the University of Reading, and also to my team at Aston University for their help with the IPA. And also thank you for listening and engaging. There's a link here to my Linktree, which has my ORCID for other publications and videos of talks and information about the Wellbeing Hub, which is the project I'm involved in now around autistic thriving. But I'm really, really keen to hear about how any of these themes might relate to the research that you do, and in particular to that idea of how do we free ourselves from these problematic ideas around rigor. I'm not suggesting we throw rigor out, but I'm suggesting we might need to do rigorous research differently. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. We got 15 minutes for Q&A. So there are some comments here. Jo, if you want to look at.
Yeah.
Totally.
Oh, thank you, Chan, and thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I mean, I have to say there was the wow moment for me when I went to my inbox the next day and saw Emily's book. Just such an extraordinary contribution. Definitely a wow moment. Lena is saying Emily's written expression is incredible. It teaches us so much about what and how we research from a positive viewpoint and how reductionist that is. Absolutely, absolutely. And this is where I see qualitative methodologies as potentially inseparable from emancipatory methodologies. I really feel that that they lend themselves so well to this kind of disruptive, challenging work. But I think we would be naive to dismiss the idea that positivism really just kind of still hangs around. It's still kind of there, you know, particularly within, you know, the drive to open research, for example. I find myself really struggling sometimes with how the intersubjectivity, the deep subjectivity of qualitative processes kind of map on to the ideas of open research. And reproducibility and pre-registration and those kinds of things. I find them, in my own mind, I find it difficult to reconcile those ideas. Did any of your other participants opt for the same as Emily? Yes, Deborah, they did. So I had one other participant who she used Post-it notes instead, and I've reproduced the Post-it notes in the paper if you want to go and have a look at them. There's photographs of them and I've transcribed them as well. So she used Post-it notes to describe her school life, and then again we used email to talk about those Post-it notes. And again, that process took quite a long time. So for her and Emily, I mean, the whole process, we had like 5 different points of meeting each child, because also after the analysis, I met with them again and we discussed the analysis and they gave me their feedback on the analysis. So that's the thing that I would say is that, you know, the time that it takes to create these spaces of openness and disruption are sometimes incompatible with the timescales we have as academics to do this. This was during my PhD, which didn't feel luxurious at the time, but now feels like a luxurious amount of time to be able to do something. So yes, one of my other participants did that. And also the study that I'm currently involved in, we have a number of participants who are engaging in non-speaking ways with the research process. Chopin is saying questions about working on linguistic research with people on the autistic spectrum. However, as the talk progressed, I realised you've answered most of them. Would you, there seems quite detailed there, so maybe I could respond to those. What do you think, Vishnu? Have I got time to go through those now? Or?
Yeah, you do. Do you want me to read it or just summarize it?
Yes, please.
I think the first question relates to the dichotomy between this non-autistic researcher and who is an insider, and how do we manage that, you know, that kind of power relationship is the question. If you're not an insider.
So, I mean, the most important thing is to have autistic people involved in the research. Now, with my, you know, to be involved in the interpretation, to be involved in the reflexive processes around the research. So as a non-autistic researcher myself, that's so important, so important. I wouldn't be able to do my research if I wasn't joined by autistic people, and being able to kind of hold myself to account, to make clear what is unknown to me about my positionality, the levels of privilege that I may have in terms of who I am and the space that I occupy in relation to my participants, but also in relation to my understanding about autistic culture and autistic ways of being. These are, you know, it's part of my reflexive toolkit that I engage with practices with autistic people to support me in being able to develop that self-awareness that I talked about earlier. I think that's absolutely crucial. And it's really, really encouraging to see that there are a number of different journals that are insisting on that involvement before publication. I think it's really, really important. sorry, what was the other aspect of that question, Vishnu?
you answered. I think you answered that, the other one. So I'm just going to read the one in terms of what's your view on the ethics of IQ scales and the discrete distinction between normal and neurodivergent.
Well, I think IQ is the whole concept of IQ has got an incredibly toxic past, and is extraordinarily unhelpful, even when used in the very best intended ways. I also think it's quite reductive in the sense that you're reducing the whole, when we're thinking about phenomenology, when we're thinking about the full richness and complexity of a life lived, we're reducing that to a number. I think that, for me personally, philosophically, is a jarring concept. It doesn't kind of sit well with me as an individual. And those discrete distinctions between normal and abnormal, they kind of hark back to the medical model of thinking that's kind of pathologized nature of kind of interpreting difference, not just in relation to neurodiversity, but also in relation to all other aspects of human difference. So I think those are also incredibly problematic, and I would be very cautious about that. But having said that, I'm very much aware of the fact that as a researcher, my neurodevelopmental identity is a very important aspect of my positionality. I happen to exist in a way, and think in a way, and behave in a way, and communicate in a way that is supported by the society in which I live in. I occupy a majority status, and with that comes an extraordinary amount of privilege for me. And knowing that those same privileges are not bestowed to my participants in that same way is such an important dimension of me thinking about the power relations between me and my participants. So I have a neuronormative identity, a neuromajority identity, whereas my participants have a neurominority identity. And so that distinction matters to me so much more than a pathologized, medicalized idea. I'm much more interested in the social and political differences, the social and political lines that separate a favored majority identity from a less favored minority identity, because I think that those distinctions are absolutely central to my interpretation of what my participants tell me about their lives. So I think that distinction is important. I'm less concerned about those medicalized interpretations. I think they are irrelevant to what I would like to do.
I think the final question is, how does consent play out in such experiments? I think by experiments, they might mean the traditional positivist, because obviously phenomenology or critical approaches doesn't have such a colonial positivist style. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the tricky thing, isn't it? Because this is, I was working with children. So when we're talking about consent in that very positivist kind of traditional sense, the parents were consenting to their children taking part. So it was very important to me to work on the principle of assent, to work on the principle that, I needed to check that my participants were happy to take part, that this was meaningful to them, that they wanted to do this, that they weren't feeling coerced or pressured. And there were lots of things that we did in that. So it wasn't so much that consent was granted and then we carried on. Like there was a point at which that happened, and then the rest of the study carried on. It was part of the fabric of everything we did. So, even in the first meetings with my participants, when, before we even got to the stage where we established whether they wanted to be part of it, one of the first things I did was showed them about how to press the leave button at the top right hand corner of the Teams group. You don't want to be part of this, you can leave. You don't need to be, if you don't want to be talking to me, then you don't have to. And there'll be no negative repercussions. There'll be no questions why you might do that. This is just, you have the autonomy to make that decision. And that focus on autonomy I hope I was able to kind of embody that throughout everything we did, and particularly in the post interview or the post data collection period as well, because my participants were then still very much involved in the analysis and in checking. And for me to think, you know, again, I was so concerned about bridging that empathy gap that it was, you know, during my analysis, I was like, right, I've gone through your data and this is what this is what I've taken from it. Is that right? Have I got the right idea here? Do these sound like, you know, your experiences? Do these seem familiar to you? Does my interpretation resonate with you? So for me, that's where the embodiment of consent is that's where it happens, is in the doing of the research, in every aspect of the doing of the research. I hope that answers the question, even though it's a bit wordy.
There might be one, I mean, we might have time for one more question. I think there's a very interesting comment on the normalcy. Normalcy must be critically examined as part of the pathological spectrum rather than accepted as a neutral baseline. Viewing neurodivergence, such as autism, as a distinct and unique mode of being challenges dominant epistemologies rooted in colonial and normative frameworks. Reconceptualizing normalcy in this way opens possibilities for more inclusive and liberatory pedagogies that value difference rather than pathologize. In many ways, and that's where it gets interesting, the construct of divergence itself, like normalcy, functions as a tool of coloniality, regulating whose ways of being are rendered legitimate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Which again is why I feel much more comfortable in talking about majority and minority identities, majority and minority neurologies, simply because of that idea that, you know, are we simply shifting some language but not shifting our ideas? You know, I think that's the interesting thing, which is why I think that you can't conduct research like I do unless you are thinking about the social and political forces. If you can't do it without thinking about social justice. You can't do it without being multidisciplinary. You can't do it without having a historical foundation to what you're doing. Yes, just 100 yeses to that comment.
And also, I guess, and we need to be also careful, like we have been talking about that, applying that term to Global South, where there are many different conceptualizations for divergence. You know, there are some other questions. I don't know, maybe one more question. Did other participants also show more interest in written over spoken communication during your research?
So I'm really mindful of this because whilst there was an open invitation to our participants to engage in this research in any way they felt comfortable, there were also examples given of how you might want to do that. So, for example, you know, so you can do this in any way you like. So you can do this by talking to me, you can do this by writing to me, you could do this with photography, with drawing, with painting, you can, you know, and I'm really interested in thinking about how much did that list of options maybe guide some of those decisions. And I think it was obviously for Emily and one other participant, Chloe, the written communication was absolutely clear right from the beginning. But it was discovered through, first of all, attempting to do a spoken interview where both of them were like, no, I don't want to, you know, this isn't going to work. And Emily, as you can see, you know, I showed that transcript of the first part just to show just how uncomfortable that was and how inappropriate that was. And I took a lot of learning from that about thinking about how could have I avoided putting Emily in that situation? How could we have done things differently so that Emily didn't have to go through that? So when we're saying about participants showing interest in doing things, I think particularly with children, there is an element of kind of thinking about ways in which we can cultivate their interest before we offer the methods. You know, I don't think I'm articulating myself very well, because that's an indication of how not fully formed this idea is in my mind. But the basic answer is that 8 were just very happy to talk to me, seemingly, I think, and 2 were not.
Okay, thank you, Jo. I think it's 12:15 and that's perfect. You know,
thank you.
It's time. Yeah, thank you. This has been a wonderful session.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions and your reflections. They're wonderful. It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for your engagement and questions. So now we will reconvene. We'll have an extended lunch break. We'll reconvene at 1:30 p.m. UK time for our final session on decoloniality. Thank you everyone again and see you soon. Bye.